Well, good afternoon. I thought it'd be interesting just to talk to you about the Legacies project, which opened at the Transport Museum in March this year. London is London's a multicultural city. There are 160 different languages represented in it, and as the London Transport Museum is part of the Mayor's organisation, there's a really significant policy commitment to being as inclusive as possible to represent the whole of London in the work that we do. One of the key stories for London, and one of the means by which it's become so diverse in the last 2 or 3 generations, was the recruitment of workforce from the Caribbean, particularly by transport, in the 1950s. And this is a sensitive and it's a difficult topic to address. It's one which hasn't been particularly well dealt with before, but it's one which is really strong in Caribbean communities. So we adopted new ways of engaging in participatory practice with those communities. So I'm just going to describe it in short order the exhibition, and then talk to you a bit about participatory practice. This is not my work; it's work of my colleagues Matt Brosnan and Laura Sleeth, who I would have liked to have here, but they couldn't come this weekend. The migrant workers from the Caribbean had typically gone to the United States in the 20s and 30s. Caribbean islands are small and quite poor, and then the 1940s they began to look further afield as migration to the States became more difficult, and began to look towards working in the UK. We had done some work a long time ago. There was an exhibition in the museum in '94. We'd done some great oral histories with the first generation of people who'd come to work in transport in London. So we were able to kind of to repurpose that, but to bring it to life in a modern and a kind of more relevant way. It's often characterised as the Windrush story in the UK. In 1948, a boat called the Empire Windrush brought 250 odd single men to London looking for work. The British government of the day did their best to divert it to somewhere else, but eventually it did arrive, and the half of the men on board were accommodated in a former air raid shelter under Clapham Common, which is one of our hidden London venues at the moment. So we have a little connection of our own with the Windrush. They all rapidly got jobs, the 120 who stayed with us, and settled in Brixton, which is one of the reasons why Brixton became such a predominantly black borough in London. So when we began to look at this topic had become very controversial in the UK. The Windrush generation was discriminated against when they arrived, and aggressive government policies towards migrants in the last 15 or 20 years have seen some really outrageous treatment of people who've been in the country and at work for 30, 40, 50 years. So it's not without some kind of very, very sensitive issues. So adopting a slightly different way of collecting the material seemed very important to do with that. Exhibition is not a huge one. It's going to be on for a couple of years. It's within the museum gallery towards the end of the visitors' experience. It's deliberately kind of colourful. It's a really nice mix of objects and graphics, drawn from our collection and loaned by people who participated in the exhibition. The London Transport was short of having huge problems of recruitment in the 1950s. They tried Ireland and they tried Malta and a number of other places, but eventually sent Charles Gom to Barbados in 1956 to actually directly recruit people to come and work in London. And I think you only have to just imagine the kind of culture shock of going from the Caribbean to working in a wet bus garage in North London in the 50s to begin to see the sort of scale of what faced these mostly men initially. So they were equipped with a little information booklet on how to what awaited them. Their passage was assisted by the government of Barbados, and in particular, Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica, and Guyanese men came in significant numbers from the 50s through to the change of immigration policy in 1970 with the passing of the Immigration Act. This was a big story for the families who may be now the second or even the third generation of people who'd come to work in London. And yet it was a story which had not been told in the museum very adequately before, and which we felt we needed to use different methods to engage people, to collect material, to collect stories, and also to ask them to participate in the way that those stories were actually told in the exhibition. The oral history material is really is incredibly strong. Some of it gathered a generation ago. It was quite clear that these guys had a really difficult time when they arrived, and by engaging an advisory board of people from the community, we could begin to make sure that the story we reflected was the story of these people's lived experience rather than an expert curator's view of it, which is in effect what the 1994 exhibition had been about. And the one thing that the advisory board were really clear with our curators about was that they had to tell the whole story, and they had to tell the story of the prejudice and the racism which these guys experienced when they first arrived in London. You know, typically signs on boarding house doors saying "No Irish, no dogs, no blacks." So these were people who had been persuaded to come all the way across the Atlantic to this wet, snowy country, a pretty grim country in post-war Britain. And when they got here, the welcome wasn't quite the mother country of empire, which I think the propaganda had suggested it might have been. So the exhibition runs through that story of migration and arrival. These are all recruitment posters of one sort or another from the 50s, particularly aimed at the Caribbean community. And we also talk in the exhibition about how these guys coped with life in 1950s London, and how they created their own kind of society, despite the best efforts of some of the people around them. So cricket was a big thing. Cricketing, London Transport in those days had huge apparatus of sports clubs and pitches and so forth. West Indians are good at cricket, and so they found a kind of natural home with their own teams and their own leagues there, and this kind of mitigated for them some of the particular trauma of their arrival. And of course now the culture of the Caribbean communities has become part of the culture of London, particularly with the Notting Hill Carnival. But we've we were loaned a lot of material related to the carnival and to that process of transition across the Atlantic by people from the advisory board and their contacts. And that route out into the community gave us a reach which we wouldn't have otherwise had. And here's somebody coming back from the carnival, I think, at Highbury Islington Tube Station. It's not a kind of sight you normally see on a commute, but just when we borrowed the carnival costume of the woman in pink on the right. So I really wanted to talk about the method as much as the story. To be credible with the community, we had to engage with people for whom this was their experience, their lives. We did it particularly through TfL staff groups and their families and their connections. The woman second from the left is actually on my board at Winsome Hull. She's a senior business manager in TfL, and she's absolutely great. And we were able to, we felt we had to kind of go about this in a way that was different to the way we normally collected. So we issued briefs to people we engaged with, making it quite clear what we expected of them. We offered them honoraria and small payments for their time. We did all of this during lockdown initially, or everything done on Zoom, which made that kind of trust issue really quite hard to deliver. And although it wasn't co-creation, we didn't allow them. Allow is not the right word. They didn't tell the story kind of unalloyed without our curators helping them with it. It was much more about kind of consultation and participation than we've ever done before. And they were really quite adamant, this group, that we had to talk about. We shouldn't present a kind of rosy tinted story. So here they are at the exhibition preview in February 2022. It was an extraordinary preview. You know how it is when you send out an exhibition preview. Loads of people say that. Lots of people don't reply. Some people come. Some people on the guest list never turn up. Everybody who replied turned up. We had the most extraordinary audience that night of people who had been involved in the exhibitions process. And I looked out across the gallery, and I think the audience that night was 75% black, which we'd never seen before, and which, you know, if you said was going to be possible at the start of the project, I'd have been skeptical, I think. But for them, this was a new experience. This was being asked to come in and share with London public the stories that they'd kind of shared at home down through their generations up to now, rather than more widely. And I remember as I walked into the museum that evening, I heard someone say to their wife or partner, who'd have thought 20 years ago that we'd see our story here? And I kind of thought, well, if I wanted a quote for, you know, my press release, which had already gone out, that would have been, you know, a wonderful quotation to have, and was a great approbation for what we'd done. We managed to access wonderful examples of people who stayed with the transport industry. Ashley Mayers is the third generation. He works for TfL, and we got his grandfather's pocket watch that he used to wear very proudly while on duty. We've repurposed some films. We had some young black filmmakers rework a 1994 film, and then 2 new commissions for what it was like to experience London for the first time. So interestingly, when we sat down this year to plan our kind of some of our programs for the future, we said, well, whatever we're going to do, it just has to be done in a participatory fashion, because it worked so incredibly well for Legacies that we'd be mad not to use this method in the future. The exhibition is temporary. It'll probably stay in place for a couple of years. Interestingly, on the night of the opening, loads of people came up to me and said, well, this is great. You know, what are we going to do with you next? So we have set up expectations that this isn't, it's a bit like, puppy's dog is not for Christmas. This isn't just a one-off exhibition and then thank you very much, we move on. We've got to think about how we retain that engagement, otherwise we'll not be credible into the future. What worked with it? We were lucky. We chose really well with our advisory board, who kind of bought into the process straight away. The museum was very open to being told the story that they wanted to see, and to hearing sometimes that we weren't getting it right. And I'm convinced that what we've done was way better than it would have been without this type of input. There were all sorts of things about good times of the day for meetings, because these are people who are who are at work, about kind of sharing notes, having a neutral chair and so forth. But as I said, the proof of the pudding was on launch night, when literally everybody we invited came. We had to have a waiting list for a second event 2 weeks later. So many people wanted to come. And interestingly, our visitor demographics, since we opened this exhibition in March, our representation from black and minority communities in London has gone up by 50%, and it wasn't too shabby before. So we're really pleased with the result. Other things that we'll think about a bit harder about before we next use this method. This is participatory. It's not co-creation, so it's a good start. We've learned a lot of lessons. It's a much slower and more deliberative method to use than any other, so it takes time and needs to be kind of planned out quite hard, and it can be quite difficult, both for the curators who are being told how to do their job, and for some of the participants who might want to see their story represented in a different way. To do this over Zoom was I think quite an achievement. And my curators, I think, managed the really fine balance between kind of getting the exhibition out, as you know what it's like, a program, you've got an opening date, you've got a load of guests going to turn out, actually, but with keeping that balance and not taking over all the decision-making themselves. And I think they learned a lot about themselves through that. So these partnerships need to be at the core of what this museum does in a big multicultural city like London, just routinely, not a kind of one-off or short term. The participation's got to be really kind of genuine. Our challenge in the coming year, I think, is to demonstrate this is an active partnership and not just us being kind of generous to the community on a one-off basis. And as ever, this is a learning process. You always have to evaluate really hard and learn from some of your mistakes. But Legacies and public participation has been really good for us, and I think it's been really good for the participants. Thank you.